They had warned her about what to expect. At 22 years old, the Japanese nurse climbed down from the military transport into the blinding heat of a Texas afternoon. All around her, fellow captured auxiliaries gripped their meager belongings, their gazes flickering nervously toward the American sentries standing tall at the camp entrance. Her chest felt tight with dread. Everything she had been taught insisted that American soldiers were undisciplined predators who would view captured women as prizes of war. She steeled herself for verbal abuse, physical violence, or something far worse. What she encountered instead was silence. The guards maintained their positions with rigid formality. They were well-built men, clearly well-nourished, their military uniforms pressed and clean, their weapons held in perfect vertical alignment. Their expressions revealed nothing beyond the mechanical execution of routine duty. An officer approached with an interpreter at his side. The interpreter barked commands in Japanese to form two orderly lines. There were no insults hurled, no leering glances, just procedural directives. The prisoners complied, but their minds struggled to process what was happening. Where was the mockery, the gloating triumph, the degradation they had anticipated? Why did these soldiers behave as though processing them was merely another administrative task rather than an opportunity for conquest? Within the intake tent, medical personnel stood ready with documentation materials. Each woman had her name, age, and military unit carefully recorded. Identification tags were distributed. The camp regulations were methodically explained. Fraternization was strictly prohibited. No preferential treatment would be granted. No exceptions would be made under any circumstances. The interpreter took care to repeat the camp's official policy in precise Japanese. American military personnel are forbidden from approaching prisoners outside official duties. Personal interaction of any kind is absolutely prohibited. This is mandated by the Geneva Convention. The words struck like a physical blow. Some of the women exchanged uncertain looks. They had steeled themselves for unwanted advances, perhaps even for attempts at bribery or coercion. Instead, they were being informed of the exact opposite. An impenetrable barrier of regulations stood between them and their captors. As medical personnel examined their injuries, this professional detachment continued without variation. Bandages were applied with efficiency. Body temperatures were measured. Vaccination histories were documented. No lingering physical contact occurred. No unnecessary inquiries were made. The young nurse sat rigidly on a wooden bench while an American medic wrapped her injured wrist. He wore medical gloves. He communicated only through the interpreter. Then he moved immediately to the next patient without so much as a backward glance. This was not coldness born from hatred or disgust. This was coldness generated by strict procedural adherence. The kind of impersonal courtesy she had never conceived could exist between enemies. At the tent's far end, a large notice board displayed text in both English and Japanese that read "Personal contact between United States personnel and prisoners is forbidden. All prisoner requests must be processed through official camp command channels." She stared at those words, struggling to reconcile them with everything she had been told back home in Japan. This was neither indulgence nor cruelty. This was a complete refusal to cross boundaries she had assumed were non-existent in warfare. As she followed the line of women toward the barracks buildings, comprehension slowly dawned. Whatever this place represented, it operated according to rules more powerful than propaganda. And that realization was more psychologically disorienting than any abuse could have been. The barracks structures were simple wooden buildings arranged in precise rows behind layers of barbed wire fencing. Inside, afternoon sunlight streamed through elevated windows, illuminating the edges of metal-framed bunks equipped with thin mattresses. The women entered with hesitation, anticipating a prison cell atmosphere. What they discovered instead was systematic organization. Beds were methodically arranged, blankets were folded identically, storage lockers bore numerical designations, and posted regulations appeared in both English and Japanese. 2 female interpreters, volunteers from the Women's Army Corps, stood prepared to clarify camp operations. They distributed uniforms, towels, and printed schedules outlining daily activities. Breakfast service at 600 hours. Morning roll call at 700 hours. Lights out at 900 hours. Unauthorized contact with guards strictly forbidden, the printed sheet stated. Each regulation reinforced the identical message of boundaries, discipline, and predictability. Initially, the women conversed in hushed whispers among themselves. Some had believed that American guards would attempt to barter advantages in exchange for cooperation. Others had imagined nighttime inspections accompanied by whispered threats. None of these scenarios materialized. The guards outside walked their designated patrol routes with mechanical precision. Inside the barracks structures, no soldier entered without explicit authorization from a female interpreter present. Meals arrived on wheeled carts, delivered by kitchen personnel rather than guards. When one woman accidentally spilled her soup due to nervousness, a civilian worker simply handed her a replacement without comment or judgment. The young nurse sat on her assigned bunk, clutching the printed list of regulations. "This makes no sense," she murmured in Japanese to herself. "They are treating us like hospital patients under care." Yet the underlying tension did not evaporate immediately. Some prisoners continued to suspect hidden motives. Was this elaborate performance designed to lower their defenses before revealing true intentions? But as days progressed, clear patterns emerged. Inspections were conducted briefly and impersonally. Supply distribution occurred at identical times each week. Medical examinations followed routine protocols and were conducted by female medical staff whenever possible. Not once did a guard violate the boundaries of professionalism. Their demeanors were courteous, yet completely unreadable, as though they wore invisible masks constructed from military discipline. One evening, a guard walked past while the women were hanging laundry to dry. He deliberately averted his eyes entirely, keeping his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. That gesture shocked them more profoundly than any stare would have. The young nurse recorded in her diary that evening, "They do not look at us. They do not speak unless official duty requires it. It is as though we have become invisible to them, except as entries in paperwork." This realization struck with greater force than cruelty could have achieved. They were indeed captives, but they were also subjects within a system that absolutely refused to blur established boundaries. For women raised to anticipate the opposite, that complete rejection represented its own form of profound shock. Days accumulated into weeks, and the rhythms of camp existence became almost mechanically predictable. Each morning at roll call, the women assembled in formation, counted off their numbers, and returned to their barracks without incident or variation. The sheer predictability gradually eroded their initial terror. No midnight raids materialized. No intrusive inspections occurred. No secret punishments were administered. Instead, there was only order, documentation, and schedules maintained with absolute consistency. A bulletin board was installed near the mess hall entrance displaying notices in both English and Japanese. It listed work assignments, mail delivery schedules, and prominently featured a notice stating questions should be directed to the interpreter. It was at that bulletin board where the young nurse first witnessed an American guard kneel down to help adjust the bootlace of a prisoner who had stumbled and fallen. He did not otherwise make physical contact with her. He did not even speak to her directly. He simply assisted her in standing upright and then stepped back to resume his position. The gesture was startling in its straightforward simplicity. He offered no smile. He did not linger for gratitude. He performed what he evidently considered his duty and immediately returned to his assigned post. Some prisoners began recognizing that the guards were operating within a comprehensive system. Strict regulations governed even acts of basic kindness and assistance. Help was provided as a matter of official policy, not as personal favoritism. When mail call was announced, the women were provided with blank writing paper and informed they could compose letters to their families. This too came with explicit restrictions. No specific details about camp layout could be included. No coded messages were permitted. Every letter would undergo censorship review. Still, the mere possibility of communicating with home felt like a crack appearing in the wall of isolation. The nurse stared at the blank paper for an extended period before writing simply, "I am alive." They treat us according to regulations. Around her, other women composed similar messages, their hands trembling as though the act itself might somehow invite punishment. But no punishment materialized. Gradually, an unfamiliar emotion began surfacing among them. Relief. These soldiers were not friends or allies, but they were not predators either. One evening, as the sun descended behind the barbed wire perimeter, the prisoners observed the guards withdrawing to their own quarters rather than lingering near the barracks. The boundary was absolutely maintained. The young nurse whispered to her bunkmate, "They will not cross that line. It exists like a glass wall between us." Her bunkmate nodded slowly, still uncertain whether to feel safer or more unsettled by this reality. The concept that American soldiers would reject even simple camaraderie challenged everything their propaganda had taught them about the enemy. This was not indulgence or kindness. This was discipline. And within that rigid discipline existed an unexpected form of dignity, a peculiar type of respect born from absolute refusal. The camp's official rulebook became nearly as familiar to the prisoners as their own memories and experiences. It was read aloud twice weekly by an interpreter, its pages warned from constant handling and reference, no gifts permitted, no favours granted, no conversations beyond official duty requirements. Those words were drilled into both guards and prisoners with equal insistence. Initially, the regulations sounded like barriers designed to isolate. Over time, they began sounding like protective measures. Within the barracks, whispered speculation evolved into cautious group discussions. Women debated why American soldiers maintained such rigidity in their conduct. Was this behavior motivated by fear? Was it driven by contempt? Or was something else entirely at work? The young nurse overheard two guards conversing outside one evening. They spoke in subdued English, but the interpreter later clarified that fraternization with prisoners of war is absolutely forbidden, with court-martial proceedings for anyone violating the prohibition. That revelation spread through the women like wildfire. This was not merely politeness or cultural courtesy. This was established law. The Americans had bound themselves to regulations as tightly as the prisoners were confined by fences and wire. During mealtimes, the separation became visually obvious. Guards ate at their own designated tables positioned at considerable distance, their backs turned away. Prisoners formed lines under civilian staff supervision, were served their portions, and returned to their seats without a single word being exchanged with military personnel. One afternoon, a small group of women attempted to present hand-sewn cloth armbands to a guard as tokens of appreciation for medical supplies received. He refused immediately, physically stepping backward and signalling to the interpreter to explain the policy once again. The refusal left the women stunned and confused. In their cultural context, gifts represented a mechanism to build obligation, to secure ongoing protection and favourable treatment. Here, such gestures were utterly meaningless. For the first time, the women began perceiving the Americans not as potential tormentors nor potential allies, but as functionaries within an enormous bureaucratic system. The young nurse wrote in her diary that their rejection possesses the quality of steel. They neither hate us nor desire us. They simply execute their assigned work and disappear. This pattern of rejection produced a curious psychological effect. Instead of feeling vulnerable to predatory behavior, the women began experiencing safety. Safety existed within walls of discipline they did not fully understand, but could increasingly predict. At night, the camp descended into quietness. Guards conducted patrols in silence, lights dimmed at the identical hour nightly. Even the footsteps of the sentries marked time with metronomic regularity. It was within that steadiness that fear began gradually ebbing away. They still harboured mistrust and doubt, But the rhythm of refusal established an unusual sense of order and security. What had been rumours spread back home about American soldiers leering, shouting obscenities, or committing worse violations began crumbling away. The myth of dishonour upon capture dissolved not through kindness or sympathy, but through rigid structure and systematic adherence to regulations. By the third week of captivity, the camp's operational routines had become ingrained as second nature. Morning roll call, work assignments, scheduled meals, periodic inspections. Yet beneath this surface normality, a new form of tension flickered. The women had successfully adjusted to adequate food, proper beds, and clean clothing. But their minds continued struggling to reconcile this new reality with everything they had been taught. Some had begun testing the edges of the established rules, curious about the men who guarded them with such systematic detachment. The young nurse observed how one particular guard consistently paused near the infirmary building. He did not speak to anyone, did not stare at the women, but his presence lingered like an unanswered question hovering in the air. She found herself wondering whether he might someday speak beyond official orders, or whether his silence represented a permanent condition. One afternoon, she deliberately thanked him in broken, heavily accented English for delivering medical bandages to the infirmary. He responded only with a single brief nod and immediately walked away without further acknowledgement. This rejection startled her more deeply than cruelty or hostility would have. It was clean, impersonal, and completely unassailable. Throughout the barracks, whispered speculation continued growing. Some women theorized that the Americans were forbidden contact by their own commanding officers under threat of severe punishment. Others insisted the guards were merely biding time, waiting for the appropriate moment to reveal their true predatory nature. But the observable truth remained unchanged day after day. No boundaries were ever crossed. When guards delivered supplies or materials, they did so exclusively through interpreter intermediaries. When injuries or medical issues occurred, female medics handled treatment whenever possible. The pattern began creating a paradox in the prisoners' minds. The women, having once been terrified of assault and abuse, now found themselves puzzling over why the soldiers maintained such extreme distance. During mealtimes, the prisoners could observe the guards laughing and joking among themselves, but never engaging with the captives in any manner. The separation functioned as a wall of silence constructed from orders and military legal code. For women raised within a military culture where hierarchical power often blurred into control and humiliation, this deliberate separation felt profoundly alien and unfamiliar. Yet it simultaneously felt secretly safer than any alternative. At night they whispered they are like shadows carrying rifles, one woman said. The young nurse wrote in her diary, "I expected to encounter monsters. Instead, I have found ghosts of discipline." The phrase circulated quietly through the barracks, like a secret code phrase they had discovered together. Yet even as distance and separation defined their daily interactions, the prisoners gradually sensed something else beneath the surface, a quality of reluctance. The Americans' refusals seemed less like contempt or hatred than like active restraint being constantly maintained. Some women admitted privately among themselves that this restraint felt safer than any kindness or sympathy could possibly feel. Better to have a wall, one prisoner stated, than to have a trap. Heads nodded in agreement around her bunk that evening, and so the camp settled into its new normal state of existence. No intimacy existed, no favours were granted, but equally no violations occurred. The initial shock of capture had gradually faded into a muted astonishment at being treated strictly according to established rules and regulations. By the fourth week of captivity, the camp authorities expanded the male correspondence program. Each woman was now permitted to write one letter every 2 weeks, which would be inspected but otherwise remain unaltered. Stacks of envelopes appeared on the mess hall tables one morning. The interpreter carefully explained how to properly address them, how to sign names in both language scripts. The act felt almost ceremonial in nature, like being momentarily reconnected to another world that existed beyond the wire. The young nurse stared at her blank page for a long moment, unable to decide what words to write. Then she composed simply, "I am alive and unharmed. They treat us with regulations and procedures." Around her, other women scribbled similar brief notes, each letter representing a small confession to families still enduring rationing and propaganda back home. The mail program infused the camp with a new kind of energy and purpose. Women traded precious paper for pencils, asked interpreters how best to phrase certain sentences, even dared to describe the meals or medical care they had received. Yet they simultaneously hesitated. Some letters were torn up completely and rewritten after second thoughts and reconsideration. Would their families actually believe such descriptions? Would military censors delete their carefully chosen words? One evening, several days later, the interpreter returned carrying replies that had arrived, short messages written in faint ink, somehow smuggled across vast oceans and continents. Some of the women cried silently, clutching the envelopes tightly to their chests as though holding something precious and fragile. Within those replies were anxious questions. Is this true? Are you genuinely alive? Do they actually feed you adequately? For the first time, the women recognized how captivity could carry not only personal shame, but profound relief for loved ones desperately worried about their fate. The nurse noticed her own tone changing as she composed subsequent letters. She no longer wrote exclusively about fear or confusion and disorientation. She wrote about daily routine, about learning a few basic English words, about the quietness of the nights. And she noticed something else significant about how the Americans enforced the letter regulations as strictly as everything else in camp operations. No personal notes could be included for guards. No thank you gifts could be enclosed. The separation remained absolute and complete. This refusal to blur the lines between captor and captive created a strange form of respect that the women had not anticipated. The Americans were not attempting to win hearts or minds. They were only following their regulations with mechanical precision. The women gradually began understanding that the guards' systematic rejection of familiarity was not intended as an insult, but represented a system deliberately designed to prevent both sides from crossing a line that could never be uncrossed once violated. At night, reading her letter back to herself before sealing it, the nurse wrote in her diary, "They will not accept gifts, nor kindness, nor any closeness. Perhaps that absolute refusal is why I can finally sleep peacefully." For the first time since her capture and transportation to this camp, she fell asleep before the official lights out call. Her breathing was steady and calm, no longer lying awake waiting for some unseen cruelty to materialize from the darkness. By midsummer, the camp had settled into an almost mechanical operational rhythm that felt predictable and secure. Wake-up call at dawn, breakfast service, assigned work details, mail hour, lights out. The fear that had dominated those early days had faded into a cautious routine that felt almost normal. The women began organizing themselves within the barracks structures. Some voluntarily took on cleaning duties and maintenance tasks. Others taught basic writing skills to those who had never received formal education. Even within captivity, small social hierarchies and genuine friendships began emerging and developing. They still harbored expectations that the rules would suddenly break at any moment, revealing the true nature of their captors. Yet the American soldiers never wavered. They maintained their distance consistently, always remaining polite, yet always remaining firm. It was discipline transformed into a daily protective wall. One morning, the young nurse observed a guard issuing routine orders to a group of newly arrived prisoners. His tone was clipped and professional, but contained no cruelty or malice. He pointed toward the rules posted prominently on the wall, then stepped back immediately, leaving the interpreter to handle all additional details. She realized with some surprise that she had not witnessed a guard raise his voice in anger for several weeks. Not one physical slap had been administered. Not one verbal threat had been issued. Instead, Everything proceeded through established procedure and protocol. This unwavering consistency gradually eroded her reflexive fear response. "They are not unpredictable or chaotic," she wrote in her diary that evening. "They are like clocks that happen to carry rifles." Some women found this unvarying routine psychologically unbearable and stifling. Others found it strangely comforting and reassuring. After months of warfare and chaos, the predictability demonstrated by the Americans felt like an unusual kind of safety net catching them. During the evenings, the guards rotated through their patrol assignments with precision. Women sat on their bunks reading donated books, humming fragments of songs, or working on small sewing projects. The low murmur of American voices outside gradually became background noise, no longer perceived as a threat or danger. Letters continued arriving periodically from Japan. Some brought messages of hope and encouragement. Others brought heartbreaking news of losses and destruction. But each letter made the women feel anchored to their past existence, even as their present circumstances reshaped their fundamental beliefs about the world. And with each passing day, they witnessed how firmly the Americans separated official duty from personal sentiment. No favors were granted. No unauthorized contact occurred. No special treatment was provided, even for the seriously ill beyond standard medical care protocols. The nurse began perceiving the guards through an entirely different lens. They were not cruel men holding absolute power over helpless captives. They were soldiers obeying a comprehensive code that left minimal room for abuse, but simultaneously left minimal room for human connection. It was a paradox she continued struggling to reconcile psychologically. How could people so careful and disciplined also serve as the enemy in whose name bombs had fallen on cities she had known and loved? She started sketching the camp layout in a small notebook she had acquired. Rows of barracks buildings, guard towers, the surrounding barbed wire perimeter. She drew the guards as tall silhouettes, faceless but orderly, like pillars supporting some invisible architecture of rules. It was through these careful sketches that she began understanding her own internal transformation. The drawings were no longer filled with representations of fear and terror. They had become diagrams illustrating a system, not depicting monsters. By the 5th week of captivity, a subtle but significant transformation had taken firm hold inside the barracks. What had begun as pure disbelief had evolved into reluctant acceptance. What had begun as paralyzing fear had evolved into a complicated form of respect. The women began talking openly during evening hours about the guards, no longer with fear but with genuine curiosity. Why were these men so consistently restrained? Why did they function like machines of order rather than men seeking conquest? Some compared them to the military officers they had known and served under back home. "Our commanders were highly visible and loud," one woman observed. "These ones disappear behind their regulations." Heads nodded in agreement through the dim light. The nurse began noticing how even the smallest gestures followed established patterns without deviation. Guards stepping back immediately after distributing supplies. Refusing all offered gifts without hesitation. Declining any attempts at small talk beyond official orders. It was not merely the written rules being followed. It represented an entire culture constructed around maintaining boundaries. A comprehensive system where soldiers protected not only the captives, but simultaneously protected themselves from moral compromise and violation of their code. During afternoon work details, the women cleaned the kitchen facilities while American military police supervised from a respectful distance. No harsh words were spoken. No physical pushing occurred. When assigned tasks were completed, they were dismissed back to barracks with simple nodded acknowledgements. For women raised within a military culture where rigid hierarchy often blurred into personal humiliation, this impersonal consistency felt profoundly alien. Yet it simultaneously felt secretly safer than any alternative they could imagine. At night, the nurse thought of her family members and of Japan itself. She wondered what her brothers would say if they could somehow see her current circumstances. Adequately fed, properly clothed, guarded by men who treated her with regulations instead of fists or worse. She found herself writing differently in her letters home. Instead of describing fear, she described daily routines. Instead of describing humiliation, she described systematic order. "They do not treat us as hated enemies," she carefully wrote. "They treat us as official obligations to be properly managed." The letters underwent censorship review, but were still permitted to pass through and be mailed. Somewhere across the vast ocean, family members read words that directly contradicted everything they had been told about American barbarity and savagery. Some women whispered among themselves that perhaps this discipline represented America's true strength in warfare. Not superior weapons or technology, but the demonstrated ability to enforce boundaries even over prisoners. Others argued it represented strategic calculation, a method to collect intelligence or create favorable propaganda for international audiences. But even the most skeptical admitted they experienced less fear now than at any point since their initial capture. The nurse began experiencing an unexpected shift occurring deep inside herself. The Americans' systematic rejection of intimacy no longer registered as an insult or slight. It felt like proof that she existed as something beyond being merely an object of warfare. In her diary, she wrote their refusal represents a strange form of respect. "I do not fully understand why this feels like a kind of freedom." Late summer evenings in the camp brought an unusual sense of calm and peace. Crickets outside the wire perimeter sang their songs against the low, steady hum of electrical generators, and the sky above transformed through shades of deep red-orange before fading completely to black. Inside the barracks, women folded their blankets with a precision that mirrored the guards' own meticulous habits. In her heart, she recognized something had fundamentally changed. "We eat, we sleep, we live," she wrote in careful script. For the first time since the surrender that had brought her here, she began planning for an actual future. Not a heroic escape attempt or a glorious death. A future comprised of days that would follow one another without constant terror. The guards, for their part, maintained their professional distance with iron consistency that never wavered. No gifts were accepted, no personal questions were asked, no favors were granted beyond what regulations explicitly allowed. Some of the younger women had attempted early on to test these boundaries through flirtation or verbal compliments. Every single time, the guards responded identically by stepping back physically, redirecting the interaction, or reporting the incident to a superior officer. It was not cruelty being demonstrated. It was a refusal that left absolutely no ambiguity about acceptable behavior. The women gradually began understanding that this too represented official policy. The Americans would not risk violating their code for sentiment or personal feeling. And strangely, this absolute refusal began registering as its own distinct form of safety and protection. They no longer feared being singled out individually or exploited for personal gratification. In rejecting all closeness uniformly, the guards had rendered every woman equally invisible and therefore equally protected under the same regulations. At night, the nurse remembered the officers she had served under in Japan during her nursing training and service. She remembered being slapped across the face, enduring verbal insults, undertaking long forced marches while suffering from fever, and experiencing the profound humiliation of being treated as completely expendable and worthless. The contrast was psychologically dizzying. She recognized now that what she had once interpreted as strength, demonstrated through cruelty and arbitrary exercise of power, was actually only another manifestation of weakness. The Americans' restraint, frustrating as it sometimes felt, demanded a far stronger form of discipline than violence had ever required. Some women whispered cautiously among themselves that perhaps this quality explained why America was winning the war. Not because of superior weapons or industrial capacity, but because of systematic organization and demonstrated self-control. The idea felt dangerous to articulate aloud, yet it spread quietly through whispered conversations. The nurse closed her diary for the evening. The guards' shadows passed along the exterior of the barracks like clock hands marking time. She no longer trembled at the sight of those silhouettes. She still did not know how long this captivity would ultimately last, or what future waited beyond the wire perimeter. But she knew now, in a way she had not known before, that she would survive this experience with her fundamental dignity remaining intact. Autumn wind rattled the barbed wire fencing, scattering dried leaves across the campyard in swirling patterns. The once harsh, blinding sunlight of midsummer had mellowed considerably, and the days grew progressively shorter. For the women confined inside the barracks, time itself felt qualitatively different now, not like serving a prison sentence, but like passing through a season. The nurse watched the guards conducting morning roll call. Their uniforms remained identical, their facial expressions remained unchanged, but she now fully understood the underlying pattern, the meticulous verification of names, the exact spacing of their steps, the deliberate manner in which orders were delivered. It was all component parts of a structure deliberately designed to keep chaos and disorder at bay. She no longer mistook this behavior for emotional coldness or contempt. She recognized it as the identical discipline that prevented them from exploiting her vulnerability. One afternoon, during a work detail in the small garden area, the women were granted additional time to tend the plants they had sown weeks earlier. Small green shoots now stood where bare dirt had existed before, a living metaphor for their own gradual transformation. The guards remained back at a distance, observing quietly. No shouting occurred. No interruptions were made. The women worked in companionable silence, feeling the sun warming their faces and their hands working the soil. For a brief moment, the distant war seemed very far away indeed. The nurse thought of her mother again, of her childhood home, of a life that existed beyond uniforms and military salutes. She did not yet know whether Japan would ultimately win or lose this war, but she did know with certainty that the world she had been raised to believe in had fundamentally cracked and fractured. At night, the barracks carried the faint, pleasant scent of soap and dried leaves. Women whispered about what they would do after the war eventually ended. Return to nursing work, open a small shop, or simply disappear quietly into family life. They no longer whispered about dying with honor on the battlefield. The Americans' systematic rejection of intimacy had accomplished something her own army had never managed to achieve. It had forced her to perceive herself as a complete person, not merely as a function within a war machine. She realized that her identity no longer depended on how men perceived her or how officers judged her worth and value. Her identity was being constructed from the small daily acts of survival she performed each day. Folding a blanket properly, tending a plant carefully, writing a letter home. The guard's flashlight swept across the barracks interior one final time before the lights-out call. She met his eyes briefly across the distance, and he looked away immediately as always, maintaining his required distance. In that tiny habitual gesture was contained the entire story of her captivity and transformation. She lay down on her bunk, pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the cooling night air. She remained a prisoner, still thousands of miles from home, but the raw terror that had greeted her arrival had completely dissipated. In its place existed a strange steadiness, a knowledge that she would eventually leave this camp as herself, fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered most. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind moving through the wire perimeter. She no longer imagined rifles being pointed or punishments waiting at dawn. She imagined instead the sound of ocean waves at home, a train station platform, her mother's welcoming voice calling her name,